The torn fabric of her dress caught on the rough bark as Christine Johnson pressed herself against the pine tree, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. Through the dense forest, she could hear them calling her name, their voices carrying a menace that made her blood run cold. The mountain wind whipped through the trees, and she pulled the ragged shawl tighter around her shoulders. Christine! The voice of Samuel Chavez echoed through the wilderness, but it wasn't the gentle tone she remembered from their childhood. This was different, harder, filled with an ownership that made her skin crawl. You can't hide forever. She closed her eyes, feeling the bark bite into her back. The garment had been beautiful once, a wedding dress her mother had sewn with such care. Now it hung in tatters, torn by brambles and branches, stained with Fudd and her own tears. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had fled her wedding in the very dress meant to bind her to a man she could never love. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, and Christine knew she had to move. Her bare feet were already cut and bleeding from the rocky terrain, but she had no choice. Behind her lay a life of servitude to a man who saw her as property. Ahead lay the unknown dangers of the untamed wilderness. She chose the wilderness. As she stumbled through the underbrush, her dress caught again, this time on a fallen branch. She heard the fabric tear, a long rip that exposed her leg to the cold mountain air. For a moment, she almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Here she was, fleeing for her very life, and she was worried about a torn dress. The voices were getting closer. She could hear Samuel's horse snorting, could hear the leather of his saddle creaking as he moved through the trees. Soon they would find her, and when they did, there would be no escape. The marriage contract had been signed, the dowry paid. In the eyes of the law and the community, she belonged to Samuel Chavez, whether she willed it or not. Christine pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain in her feet and the burning in her lungs. The forest seemed to go on forever, an endless maze of trees and shadows. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw it, a thin column of smoke rising above the tree line. She changed direction, following the smoke like a beacon. The terrain grew rougher, more treacherous, but she pressed on. Behind her, she could hear Samuel calling to his men, coordinating their search. They were close, too close. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, boom, a rough-hewn structure that looked as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and through the single window she could see the warm glow of firelight. Without hesitation, she stumbled toward the door and pounded on it with her fists. "Please," she called out, her voice hoarse from running, thrown in fear. "Please, I need help." The door opened so suddenly that she nearly fell forward. A man stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore simple clothes, a flannel shirt and worn trousers, but there was something about him that spoke of strength and self-reliance. "What's all this noise?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. His eyes moved over her torn dress, her disheveled hair, her bleeding feet, but his expression remained impassive. "They're coming for me," Christine gasped, glancing back toward the forest. "Please, I need somewhere to hide. I'll do anything, pay you anything. Just please don't let them take me back." The man, who she would later learn was called Eric Harris, studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. Christine stumbled into the cabin, grateful for the warmth and the solid walls around her. The interior was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that spoke of practical skill rather than artistic pretension. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the smell of something cooking filled the air. "Sit," Eric said, pointing to a chair near the fire. "You're bleeding." Christine looked down at her feet and saw that he was right. She had left a trail of blood across his clean floor, and the sight of it made her feel sick with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I've ruined everything." Eric didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to a cabinet and pulled out a basin and some clean cloth. He filled the basin with water from a pitcher and brought it over to where she sat. Without asking permission, he knelt down and gently lifted one of her feet. "This might sting," he said, and began cleaning the cuts with careful, practiced movements. Christine bit her lip to keep from crying out. The water was cold, and the cuts were deeper than she had realized. But there was something oddly comforting about his touch, gentle despite his rough hands. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. He glanced up at her briefly, then returned to his work. "Seems like you need it." 3 months earlier, Christine Johnson had stood in the parlor of her family's modest home, listening to her father discuss her future as if she weren't in the room. Samuel Chavez sat across from him, his hat balanced on his knee, his eyes occasionally drifting to where she stood by the window. "The girl's got good breeding," her father, Aaron Gonzalez, was saying. "Christine's got her looks and her gentle nature. She'll make you a fine wife, Samuel." Christine kept her gaze fixed on the garden outside, where her mother's roses were beginning to bloom. Maria Johnson had tended those roses with such care, had taught Christine their names and how to prune them properly. "What about her housekeeping skills?" Samuel asked, and Christine could hear the calculating tone in his voice. "Can she cook, sew, keep a proper home?" Aaron shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, she's young yet. Plenty of time to learn such things after marriage." Christine turned from the window then, unable to keep silent any longer. "Perhaps you should ask me what I can do," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Both men looked at her with surprise, as if they had forgotten she could speak. Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly, and she could see him reassessing her. "Very well," Samuel said, his tone patronizing. "What can you do, Christine?" "I can read," she said, lifting her chin. "I can write. I can keep accounts and speak a little French." Samuel's expression grew cold. "Can you cook a meal? Can you mend a torn shirt? Can you keep a house clean and orderly?" Christine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I can learn." "You should have learned already," Samuel said, turning back to her father. "A woman of 20 should know these things." After Samuel left, having agreed to the match despite his reservations, Christine confronted her father in his study. "You can't make me marry him," she said, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Aaron looked up from his ledger, his face weary. "I'm not making you do anything, Christine. I'm trying to secure your future." "My future? Or your debts?" He flinched as if she had struck him. "Both, if I'm honest. Samuel's a good man, a successful man. He'll provide for you." "He doesn't love me, and I certainly don't love him." "Love," Aaron laughed bitterly. "Love is a luxury, girl, and food and shelter and security, those are necessities." Christine moved into the room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What if I refuse? What if I simply say no?" "Then we'll lose the farm," Aaron said quietly, "and you'll find yourself with nowhere to go and no means of support." The weight of his words settled over her like a shroud. She had no money of her own, no skills that would allow her to support herself. "When?" she asked, the word barely audible. 2 months, Aaron said. "Samuel wants to be married before the harvest season." Over the next few weeks, she tried everything she could think of. She wrote to her aunt in California begging for help, only to receive a letter back explaining that her aunt's own circumstances were too strained to help. She inquired about positions as a governess or companion, but her lack of references in domestic skills made her unsuitable. Desperate, she even attempted to learn some of the skills that Samuel had found lacking. She tried to teach herself to sew, using her mother's old sewing basket, but her fingers seemed to have no natural talent for the work. Her stitches were crooked and uneven, her seams puckered and weak. As the wedding date approached, Christine grew more and more desperate. Samuel visited regularly, and with each visit, his expectations became clearer. He spoke of the children they would have, of the household she would manage. He never asked about her thoughts or feelings. The final straw came 3 days before the wedding. Christine was in her room, staring at the white dress her father had commissioned, when Samuel arrived for what he called a final discussion about their future together. She found Samuel standing by the fireplace, his expression more serious than usual. Her father hovered nearby, wringing his hands. "Sit down, Christine," Samuel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She remained standing. "I prefer to stand, thank you." His eyes flashed with annoyance, but he continued. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your domestic skills, or lack thereof. I've decided that after we're married, you'll need some additional training." "Training," Christine repeated, not liking the sound of the word. "My sister Sandra Roberts runs a very efficient household," Samuel explained. "I've arranged for you to spend the first few months of our marriage with her, learning the proper way to manage a home. Christine felt the blood drain from her face. You want to send me away? Right after our wedding? Not away, Samuel corrected. To school, you might say. It's for your own good, Christine. I won't do it, Christine said, her voice shaking with anger. I won't be shipped off like a defective product that needs to be fixed. Samuel's expression hardened. You'll do as you're told. You're going to be my wife, which means you will obey me in all things. No, she said quietly. What did you say? Samuel asked, his voice dangerously low. I said no. Christine lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. I won't marry you. I won't be sent to your sister for training like some wild animal that needs to be broken. Samuel took a step toward her, his face flushing with anger. You'll change your tune once we're married. My place? Christine laughed, but there was no humor in it. And where exactly is my place, Samuel? You'll be my wife, Samuel said, as if that explained everything. You'll have a home, security, respectability. What more could a woman want? Respect, Christine said simply. Love. The chance to be seen as more than just a pair of hands to keep house with. Samuel's expression grew contemptuous. Romantic nonsense. Marriage isn't about love. It's about duty and responsibility. Then I suppose I'll have to be unhappy, she said, because I won't marry you. The silence that followed was deafening. Samuel's face went through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous purple. She'll come around, Samuel said, his voice tight with controlled fury. The contracts are signed. She'll be at that church on Saturday morning, or she'll find herself with nowhere to go. So be it, Christine said. I'd rather face the unknown than spend my life as your prisoner. The next 2 days passed in a haze of tension. Erin continued to plead with her to reconsider, while Christine quietly made her own preparations. She packed a small bag with her most practical clothes and the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her. On the morning of what should have been her wedding day, Christine rose before dawn and dressed in the white gown her father had commissioned. If she was going to flee, she reasoned, she might as well do it dramatically. She left a letter for her father, then slipped out of the house and began walking toward the mountains. The first few hours of her flight had been almost exhilarating. The morning air was crisp and clean, the mountains rose majestically before her, and for the first time in months, she felt free. But as the sun climbed higher and the terrain grew more difficult, reality began to set in. By midday, she was exhausted, hungry, and beginning to question the wisdom of her decision. She had brought no food with her, no water, no supplies of any kind. It was then that she heard the first sounds of pursuit, the distant baying of hounds, the shouts of men, the thunder of hoofbeats. Samuel had discovered her absence and organized a search party. Fear gave her new strength, and she pushed deeper into the forest, following game trails and creek beds. But she was no woodswoman, and she knew her pursuers were experienced hunters. As the afternoon wore on, her dress became more and more of a hindrance. The hem was muddy and torn, the sleeves ripped by thorns, the bodice stained with perspiration and dirt. The voices of her pursuers grew closer, and Christine realized she was trapped. That was when she saw the smoke rising above the trees and made her desperate dash for the cabin. Now, sitting by Eric Harris's fire while he tended to her wounded feet, she felt a mixture of relief and terror. Eric finished cleaning her cuts and reached for a small jar from the cabinet. This will help with the healing, he said, applying a salve that smelled of pine and herbs. Thank you, Christine whispered, watching as he wrapped her feet with strips of clean cloth. You can't stay here, he said without looking up from his work. Christine's heart sank. Please, I know I have no right to ask, but I have nowhere else to go. They'll find you if you stay here, Eric interrupted. This is the first place they'll look once they start checking the cabins. Then where can I go? Christine asked, despair creeping into her voice. Eric glanced at her torn dress, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of sympathy in his dark eyes. Why are you running? I was supposed to be married today, she said finally, to a man I don't love, who doesn't love me, who sees me as nothing more than property to be managed and controlled. So you ran away in your wedding dress, Eric observed. I know it sounds foolish, she said, but I couldn't go through with it. And what kind of wife was that? Christine felt heat rise in her cheeks. The domestic kind, the kind who can cook and clean and sew and mend. The kind who keeps her mouth shut and does as she's told. And you can't do those things? No, she whispered. I can't sew or mend. I can barely cook a simple meal. I'm useless as a wife, useless as a woman. Eric was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was matter of fact. Can you read? Yes. Write? Yes. Keep accounts? Yes. Then you're not useless, he said, standing. You just don't have the skills that man wanted. Eric moved to the window and peered out through the rough glass. They're coming, he said quietly. I can see torches through the trees. Christine's blood turned to ice. What do I do? Eric was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his options. Then he turned to her. There's a root cellar under the cabin. It's not comfortable, but it's hidden. Eric moved quickly, lifting a section of the floorboards near the fireplace to reveal a dark opening beneath. It's not much, he said, but it's dry, and they won't find you unless they know where to look. Christine looked down into the dark space and shuddered. It was barely large enough for a person to lie down in. I can't, she whispered. I can't go down there. Eric's expression softened slightly. You can and you will. It's the only way. The sound of horses was getting closer now, and Christine could hear voices calling her name. She recognized Samuel's voice, loud and angry, demanding to know if anyone had seen a woman in a white dress. Christine gathered her torn skirts and climbed down into the root cellar. The space was indeed small and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. Eric handed down a blanket and a small jar of water. Stay quiet no matter what you hear, he instructed. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Then he replaced the floorboards, and Christine was plunged into complete darkness. The wait seemed endless. Finally, she heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. Someone pounded on the door. Open up! Samuel's voice boomed. We know someone's in there! Christine heard Eric's footsteps crossing the floor above her head, heard the door open. Can I help you? Eric's voice was calm, unruffled. We're looking for a woman, Samuel said, his tone aggressive. Young, dark hair, wearing a white dress. Have you seen her? Can't say that I have, Eric replied. What's she done? She's my fiancée, Samuel said, and Christine could hear the possessive anger in his voice. She ran away from our wedding this morning. Sounds like she knew exactly what she was doing, Eric observed. There was a moment of tense silence. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice dangerously low. I don't like your tone, friend. This woman is my property, legally promised to me. Property? Eric's voice was still calm, but Christine could hear an edge of steel beneath the surface. Last I heard, slavery was illegal in these parts. Don't get smart with me, Samuel snapped. Now, are you going to let us search this cabin, or do we need to do it the hard way? Search away, Eric said finally, but you'll do it respectfully. This is my home. Christine heard the sound of multiple footsteps entering the cabin, heard furniture being moved and doors being opened. She pressed herself as flat as possible against the earth floor, hardly daring to breathe. There's women's blood on your floor, one of the searchers said. Cut myself sharpening an axe yesterday, Eric replied smoothly. Bled like a stuck pig. Christine heard more movement above, heard someone opening what sounded like every cabinet and chest in the cabin. Her heart was pounding so loudly, she was sure they would hear it. She's not here, another voice said finally. It was Edward Davis, the local sheriff. We're wasting time. She has to be somewhere, Samuel said, frustration clear in his voice. We need to keep searching, Edward said, but not here. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Harris, Eric supplied. Eric Harris. Mr. Harris, if you see anything, you'll let us know? Of course, Eric said. The searchers filed out of the cabin, their voices fading as they moved away. But Eric didn't immediately let her out. Christine lay in the darkness for what felt like hours. Finally, she heard him lift the floorboards. They're gone, he said, reaching down to help her climb out. But they'll be back. Samuel Chavez doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily. Christine emerged from the root cellar on shaking legs. What am I going to do? Eric studied her for a moment. You need to disappear, he said finally. Become someone else, somewhere else. How? I have no money, no connections, nowhere to go. The railroad passes through Millfield, about 20 miles north of here, Eric said thoughtfully. If you could get there, you could buy passage to anywhere you wanted to go. With what money? Christine asked bitterly. Eric moved to a wooden chest and pulled out a small leather pouch. He counted out several bills and held them out to her. This should be enough to get you started somewhere new. Christine stared at the money in shock. I can't take that. Why would you help me? Eric's expression was unreadable. Let's just say I don't like men who think they own women. Christine took the money with trembling hands. I don't know how to thank you. Don't worry about repaying me, Eric said. Just make sure you use the chance I'm giving you. But how do I get to Millfield? 20 miles through these mountains, and Samuel's men are everywhere. Eric moved to the window again, checking the darkness outside. There's an old mining trail that runs along the ridge. It's rough going, but it's not well known. I can't travel 20 miles in this dress, Christine said, looking down at the tattered remains of her wedding gown. Eric considered this, then went to another chest and pulled out some clothes. These might work, he said, holding up a pair of men's trousers and a flannel shirt. They'll be too big, but you can make them work. Christine stared at the clothes in horror. I can't wear men's clothing. It wouldn't be proper. Proper? Eric raised an eyebrow. You're fleeing through the wilderness from a man who wants to force you into marriage, and you're worried about propriety. When he put it that way, Christine had to admit her concern seemed foolish. You're right, she said. Christine took the clothes and retreated behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the rest of the cabin. Removing her wedding dress felt like shedding a skin, like literally casting off the life that had been planned for her. The men's clothes were indeed too large, but Christine managed to make them work by rolling up the sleeves and legs and cinching the waist with a piece of rope Eric provided. When she emerged from behind the curtain, Eric looked her up and down appraisingly. Better, he said with a nod. You'll pass for a young man from a distance. He handed her a worn felt hat and spread a rough map on the table. This is the trail you'll want to follow. Stay on the ridge as much as possible. Christine studied the map, trying to memorize the route. How long will it take me to reach Millfield? If you push hard and don't run into trouble, maybe 2 days, Eric said. But you'll need to be careful. Eric had already prepared a small pack containing dried meat, hardtack, and a water bottle. There are streams along the way where you can refill the bottle, and there's an old trapper's cabin about halfway to Millfield where you can spend the night if you need to. When should I leave? Now, Eric said, while it's still dark. The reality of what she was about to do hit Christine like a physical blow. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Eric's expression softened. Fear's not always a bad thing. It keeps you alert, keeps you alive, but don't let it paralyze you. What if I get lost? Then you'll figure it out, Eric said with quiet confidence. You're stronger than you think. You made it this far, didn't you? Christine looked around the cabin one last time. Why are you doing this for me? Eric was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was distant. I knew a woman once who was trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. I wasn't able to help her then. Maybe this is my chance to make up for that. Thank you for everything. Eric nodded and moved to the door. I'll walk with you to the trailhead. Make sure you get started in the right direction. They left the cabin together, stepping out into the cool mountain night. After about a mile of walking, they reached a rocky outcropping where a narrow trail wound up into the higher elevations. That's your path, he said. Follow it up to the ridge, then stay on the ridge trail, heading north. Christine looked up at the steep, rocky trail and felt her courage falter. I don't know if I can do this. Eric turned to face her, his dark eyes serious in the moonlight. You can do this. You have to do this. The alternative is going back to a life that will slowly kill your spirit. No what ifs, Eric interrupted. Just put one foot in front of the other and keep going. When you get to Millfield, buy a ticket on the first train heading anywhere but here. Christine nodded, shouldering her pack more securely. Will I ever see you again? Probably not, Eric said honestly, but that's not what matters. What matters is that you get the chance to build the life you want. Goodbye, Eric Harris, she said, extending her hand. He shook it firmly. Goodbye, Christine Johnson. Good luck. Christine started up the trail, her feet already aching in the borrowed boots. The path was even steeper than it had looked, and within minutes she was breathing hard. But she kept going, driven by the knowledge that every step took her further from Samuel and closer to freedom. The first few hours were the hardest. The trail was treacherous in the darkness, with loose rocks and drop-offs that appeared suddenly. Several times she stumbled and nearly fell, saved only by grabbing onto a tree branch at the last moment. But as the hours passed, she began to find her rhythm. Her body adjusted to the steady climb. Her eyes grew accustomed to reading the trail in the dim light. As dawn broke over the mountains, Christine found herself on a narrow ridge with spectacular views in all directions. She could see the valley below where her hometown lay, could even make out the church where she should have been married. The sight filled her with a mixture of sadness and relief. She was also high enough now to see the scope of the search that was underway. Smoke rose from several locations in the valley, marking the camps of the search parties. She could even see tiny figures moving along the roads below. The ridge trail was easier going than the steep climb had been, but it presented its own challenges. The path was narrow, sometimes no more than a foot wide, with sheer drops on both sides. By midday, she was exhausted and desperately thirsty. When she finally heard the sound of running water ahead, she nearly cried with relief. The stream was small but clear, tumbling down the mountainside. Christine knelt beside it and drank deeply, then refilled her water bottle. The afternoon brought new challenges. Clouds began to build over the peaks, and the wind picked up significantly. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she was grateful for the warm flannel shirt. As evening approached, she began to look for the trapper's cabin Eric had mentioned. Just as she was beginning to panic, she spotted a thin column of smoke rising from a grove of trees below the trail. She crept closer until she could see the cabin clearly. It was a small, rough structure, but it looked solid and weatherproof, and there was definitely someone inside, someone who had built a fire. As she watched, the door opened and a figure emerged. Even from a distance, Christine could see it was a man, tall and bearded, wearing the rough clothes of a mountain man. He began chopping wood, his axe ringing against the logs. Christine made her decision. She stood up and walked down toward the cabin, her heart pounding. The man looked up as she approached, his axe pausing in mid-swing. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her the men's clothes and travel-worn appearance. "Well, I'll be damned," he said finally, his voice gravelly. "What's a young fellow like you doing way up here?" Christine had almost forgotten she was supposed to be disguised as a man. She deepened her voice and tried to sound casual. "Just passing through, heading north to Millfield." The man set down his axe. "Long way to Millfield from here. You planning to walk the whole way?" "That's the idea," Christine said. "Storm's coming," the man observed, glancing up at the darkening sky. "Bad one, by the look of it." As if to emphasize his point, a rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains. The first fat raindrops began to fall. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to share your shelter for the night?" Christine asked. The man studied her for another long moment, but finally he nodded. "Come on in," he said. "Name's Edward Davis, though most folks just call me Mountain Ed." Christine's blood turned to ice. Edward Davis was the sheriff who had been with Samuel's search party, but if he recognized her, he gave no sign of it. He simply gestured for her to follow him into the cabin. The interior of the trapper's cabin was even smaller than Eric's, with just enough room for a bed, a table, and a stone fireplace. But it was warm and dry, and as the storm broke in earnest outside, Christine was grateful to be under a solid roof. Edward busied himself preparing a simple meal while Christine sat by the fire, trying to calm her racing heart. She kept waiting for him to announce that he knew who she was. "So," he said as he stirred something in a pot over the fire, "what takes you to Millfield? Got family there?" Christine had to think quickly. "Work," she said, keeping her voice low and gruff. "Heard there might be jobs at the railroad." "Could be," Edward agreed. "You look a bit young for that kind of labor, though." "I'm stronger than I look," Christine said. Edward ladled stew into 2 bowls and handed one to Christine. They ate in comfortable silence while the storm raged outside. "Bad night to be traveling," Edward observed. "Good thing you found this place." "Good thing you were willing to share it," Christine replied. Edward shrugged. Mountain code. You don't turn away a traveler in a storm. After they finished eating, Edward settled back in his chair and pulled out a pipe. You know, he said thoughtfully, I've been doing some tracking today, looking for someone. Christine's blood turned to ice, but she tried to keep her expression neutral. Oh, young woman, Edward continued, lighting his pipe. Ran away from her wedding yesterday. Her intended's got half the county out looking for her. That's so, Christine managed to say. Yep, pretty little thing from what I hear. Dark hair, delicate features. Name of Christine Johnson. Edward took a long draw on his pipe and studied Christine through the smoke. You wouldn't happen to have seen anyone matching that description, would you? Christine's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Can't say that I have, she said. Edward nodded slowly. Didn't think so. She's probably long gone by now anyway. Smart girl, if you ask me. Smart? Christine couldn't help but ask. Well, sure. Samuel Chavez is a hard man, not the kind of husband any woman with sense would want. Can't say I blame her for running. Christine stared at him in shock. But you're the sheriff. Isn't it your job to bring her back? Edward took another draw on his pipe. My job is to keep the peace and uphold the law. Far as I know, it's not illegal for a woman to change her mind about getting married. But the contracts. Contracts can be broken, Edward said with a shrug. Samuel's making a lot of noise about his rights, but the truth is, the girl's not his wife yet. Christine felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. Then why are you helping with the search? Because Samuel asked me to, and he's got influence in this county. But that doesn't mean I have to try very hard to find her. Edward winked at Christine, and she realized with a shock that he knew exactly who she was. You know, she whispered. I've known since you walked up to the cabin, Edward confirmed. You make a passable boy from a distance, but up close, there's no mistaking you. Christine felt tears prick at her eyes. Are you going to turn me in? Edward was quiet for a long moment, smoking his pipe and staring into the fire. I've got a daughter about your age, he said finally. Lives back east with her mother. If she was in your situation, I'd hope someone would help her. So you'll let me go? I'll do better than that, Edward said. I'll help you get to Millfield. I know these mountains better than anyone. Christine couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why would you do that? I know enough, Edward said. I know you've got the courage to walk away from a bad situation. That takes guts. There's one thing I need to know, Edward said, his expression growing serious. Are you sure this is what you want? Once you get on that train, there's no coming back. Christine thought about her father, about the home where she had grown up, about the life she was leaving behind. There would be sadness, she knew, and loneliness, and uncertainty. But there would also be freedom. I'm sure, she said firmly. Edward nodded approvingly. Then we'll leave at first light. They settled down for the night, Edward taking the bed while Christine made do with blankets by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, she found it difficult to sleep. When she finally drifted off, it was with a sense of anticipation rather than fear. Dawn came gray and misty, with the smell of rain still heavy in the air. Edward was already up when Christine woke, preparing breakfast and checking his gear. Ready for the last push? He asked, handing her a cup of coffee. Christine nodded, though she felt a flutter of nervousness. Today would determine whether her desperate flight had been successful. They set out as soon as they finished eating, Edward leading the way along trails that seemed to exist only in his mind. The going was easier with Edward as a guide. He knew where the streams were, where the trail was safe, and where it was treacherous. It was mid-afternoon when they heard the sound of horses behind them. Edward immediately led Christine off the trail and into a grove of trees, where they crouched behind a fallen log. Stay down and stay quiet, Edward whispered. Through the trees, Christine could see a group of riders approaching. Her heart sank as she recognized Samuel in the lead, his face grim with determination. Ryan Mendoza and several other men rode behind him. The riders paused almost exactly where Edward and Christine were hiding. Samuel dismounted and examined the ground. Someone came this way recently, he announced. 2 people, one of them smaller than the other. Could be anyone, Ryan said. Not many, Samuel disagreed, and the timing's right. Christine held her breath, pressing herself as flat as possible against the ground. Through the undergrowth, she could see Samuel's boots just a few feet away. "Which way did they go?" one of the other men asked. Samuel studied the trail for several more minutes, then remounted his horse. "North, toward Millfield?" "Just like I thought." "You think it's her?" "I know it's her," Samuel said with cold certainty. "And when I catch up with her, she's going to learn what happens to women who try to make a fool out of Samuel Chavez." The threat in his voice made Christine's blood run cold. The riders spurred their horses and continued up the trail. Edward waited several more minutes before signaling that it was safe to move. "They're ahead of us now," he said grimly. "That complicates things." "What do we do?" Edward thought for a moment. "There's another way to Millfield. Longer but less obvious. We'll have to move fast." They left the main trail and struck out across country, following game paths and creek beds. The going was much harder, but Edward seemed confident in his route. As the afternoon wore on, Christine began to flag. The constant exertion was taking its toll. Edward noticed her struggling and called a brief halt. "We're almost there," he said encouragingly. "Another hour, maybe two." "I don't know if I can make it," Christine admitted. "Yet you can," Edward said firmly. "You've come too far to give up now." They resumed their journey, Christine drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. The sun was beginning to set when they finally crested a ridge and saw the town of Millfield spread out in the valley below. "There's your train," Edward said, pointing to a locomotive that was sitting at the station, steam rising from its stack. Christine felt a surge of panic. "We have to hurry." "Easy," Edward cautioned. "We still need to be careful. Samuel and his men might already be in town." They made their way down the mountainside, staying hidden among the trees until they reached the outskirts of town. From there, Edward led Christine through back alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares. The railroad station was bustling with activity as the evening train prepared for departure. Christine could see passengers boarding, could hear the conductor calling for final boarding. "Wait here," Edward said, positioning Christine behind a stack of freight boxes. "Let me check if the coast is clear." He walked casually toward the station, scanning the crowd for any sign of Samuel or his men. After a few tense minutes, he returned with a shake of his head. "I don't see them," he said. "But that doesn't mean they're not here. We need to move fast." Christine pulled the hat down low over her face and followed Edward toward the ticket window. Her legs felt weak with nervous anticipation. "One ticket to Denver," Edward said to the clerk, placing money on the counter. "Train leaves in 5 minutes," the clerk replied, handing over the ticket. Christine took the ticket with trembling hands. Denver. She had never been there, had no idea what she would do when she arrived. But it was far from here, far from Samuel. "Thank you," she whispered to Edward, "for everything." "Get on that train and don't look back," Edward replied. "Make a good life for yourself." Christine was about to board when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" She turned to see Samuel Chavez standing at the edge of the platform, his eyes fixed on her with cold satisfaction. Ryan Mendoza and 2 other men flanked him. "Did you really think you could run from me, Christine?" Samuel asked, walking slowly toward her. "Did you think I would just let you go?" Christine backed toward the train, but one of Samuel's men moved to block her path. She was trapped. "The game's over," Samuel continued. "You've had your little adventure, but now it's time to come home." "She's not going anywhere with you," Edward said, stepping between Samuel and Christine. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he recognized the sheriff. "This is none of your business, Ed. This woman is legally promised to me." "Funny thing about promises," Edward replied calmly. "They only count when both parties agree to them." She agreed when her father signed the contract. "Her father's not here," Edward observed. "And last I checked, women in this country have the right to speak for themselves." Samuel's face flushed with anger. "Stand aside, Ed. I don't want to have trouble with you." "So will I," Edward replied, his hand moving to rest on the gun at his hip. The tension on the platform was thick. Other passengers had noticed the confrontation and were backing away. "Last call for boarding," the conductor shouted. "Get on the train, Christine," Edward said, without taking his eyes off Samuel. Christine hesitated. She couldn't leave Edward to face Samuel alone. "Go," Edward barked. Now Christine made her decision. She turned and ran for the train, leaping onto the steps just as it began to move. Behind her, she heard Samuel shout in rage, heard the sound of a scuffle breaking out. "Stop that train!" Samuel yelled, but it was too late. The locomotive was picking up speed, carrying Christine away from Millfield and toward freedom. She found a seat by the window and watched the platform recede into the distance. She could see Edward standing calmly while Samuel gestured angrily at him. As the train rounded a curve and the station disappeared from view, Christine finally allowed herself to believe that she had escaped. She was free, truly free for the first time in her adult life. The train carried her through the night toward a city where no one knew her name or her history. When she woke, it was dawn, and the train was pulling into Denver. Christine gathered her few belongings and stepped onto the platform, taking her first breath of air as a truly free woman. The city was larger and more bustling than anywhere she had ever been. People hurried past in all directions, paying no attention to one more young person arriving by train. The anonymity was both frightening and exhilarating. Christine found a small hotel near the station and rented a room for the night. Standing at the window looking out over the busy street below, Christine thought about the torn wedding dress she had left behind. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she had been that frightened girl fleeing through the forest. She would find work, somehow. She would learn the skills she needed to survive on her own. She would build a life that was entirely her own creation, free from the expectations and demands of others. 6 months later, Christine stood in the window of the small dress shop where she had found employment, watching the busy street outside. She wore a simple blue dress that she had made herself, having finally learned the sewing skills that had once seemed so impossible. The shop owner, Mrs. Sandra Roberts, had been skeptical when Christine first applied for work. But Christine had been persistent, and when Mrs. Roberts learned that she could read and write and keep accounts, she had been willing to give her a chance. "You've got a good eye for design," Mrs. Roberts said, coming to stand beside Christine at the window. "That dress you made for Mrs. Patterson turned out beautifully." Christine smiled. "Thank you, I enjoy the work." It was true, she had discovered that she did have an aptitude for sewing. Once she approached it as a creative endeavor rather than a domestic duty. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Roberts continued, "you've learned quickly and you have good ideas. How would you feel about taking on more responsibility?" Christine felt a thrill of excitement. "I would like that very much," she said. As evening approached and it came time to close the shop, Christine reflected on how much her life had changed. She had a job she enjoyed, a small but comfortable apartment, and friends among her fellow workers. Walking home through the busy streets, Christine thought about the torn wedding dress that had started it all. She had been ashamed of that dress, embarrassed by its ragged condition, but now she understood that the tears in that fabric had been symbols of liberation, not inadequacy. She understood now that her worth as a person had never been tied to her domestic skills or her ability to conform to someone else's idea of what a woman should be. She was valuable because of her intelligence, her creativity, her courage, her capacity for growth and change. The torn dress had been a symbol of her breaking free from the constraints that others had tried to place on her. Every rip and stain had been evidence of her determination to choose her own path. Now, as she climbed the stairs to her apartment, Christine smiled at the irony of it all. She had become an accomplished seamstress, not because someone had forced her to learn, but because she had chosen to learn. As she prepared her simple dinner, Christine thought about the future. She had dreams now, plans that extended beyond mere survival. She wanted to continue learning, perhaps even to open her own shop someday. The woman who had once fled through the wilderness in a torn wedding dress had found her strength, had discovered that she was capable of creating a life of her own design. She had learned that sometimes the most important journey begins with a single step away from the life others have planned for you. As night fell over Denver, Christine sat by her window with a cup of tea, watching the lights come on in the buildings around her. She thought of Eric Harris in his mountain cabin, of Edward Davis maintaining justice in his own quiet way, of all the people who had helped her along the way. Most of all, she thought of herself, of the journey from fear to courage, from dependence to independence, from shame to pride. The torn dress that had once seemed like a symbol of her inadequacy had become a symbol of her liberation. Christine Johnson had learned to sew, But more importantly, she had learned to live. And as she prepared for bed in her own apartment, wearing clothes she had made with her own hands, she knew that the torn dress had been just the beginning of her story, not the end.